ever wondered why some people seem to have a gift for music? Have you ever wished that you could play by ear, sing in tune, improvise and jam? You're in the right place. Time to turn those wishes into reality. Welcome to the Musicality Podcast with your host, Christopher Sutton.
Hello and welcome to the Musicality Podcast. My name is Christopher Sutton. I'm the founder and director of Musical You. And it's my pleasure to be joined today by Adam Liette, Sarah Campbell, and Stuart Hilton for one in a series of episodes we're doing following up on our 100th episode celebration, which was actually a two-parter featuring 26 people, experts on music education and musicality, talking about their one tip to help you unlock your inner musicality. And we're picking up on a few common themes that came through in their answers. Today we're going to be talking about exploring without self-judgment. And this came up with 5 or 6 of our guests that I noticed. David Wallyman talked about how you can get away from worrying about instrument technique by learning to sing before you pick up your instrument, or rather to put down your instrument before you try and create something in music. Bill Hilton also talked about that exploratory type of playing. Forrest Kinney said that worrying about being advanced or impressive is going to paralyze your cultivating the sensitivity, which is really what musicality is all about. So he really saw it as a crippling thing if you were getting that self-judgment going in your head while you tried to play. Leela Viss talked about how you shouldn't be sheepish about borrowing from other musicians or other creators and producing something that's not yet perfect. You know, she talked about focusing on giving things your own unique spin and exploring from there. Natalie Weber talked about giving yourself space to experiment and create, and recommended finding people and resources that support you in doing that. And Sarah Campbell, who is with us on the episode today, was talking about how children approach music and improvisation in a very different way, in part because they don't have so much of that self-judgment. So maybe we'll kick off this one with Sarah, if you don't mind. Before we do, though, we'll just do a quick intro for anyone who hasn't met Adam or Stuart before. Adam, could you just introduce yourself and what you do at Musical You and outside?
Hi, my name's Adam Liette. I'm the communications manager at Musical You. I play the trumpet and guitar and am the very proud father of 4.
Terrific. And Stuart?
Hi, I'm Stuart Hilton. I am the community conductor on the Musical U member site. You can probably see me all over the place, emails and on the site. And outside of Musical U, I play with a tribute artist, another band on the side, and at church. And there you go. I have 2 dogs. We have 2 dogs.
Very good. And Sarah, I believe you're more of a cat person, but tell us a bit about yourself.
Yes. In fact, my cat is over there sleeping as we're recording this podcast. And so I am a piano and voice teacher, and I'm also a music business coach. So I spend a lot of time talking with other teachers about all kinds of, teaching things, business things. And, improvisation is always a pretty hot topic because, there are so many wonderful resources out there now. And so we spend a lot of time chatting about it.
So I mentioned there your contribution for our roundup episode where you were talking about children and adults and their difference in mindset. Could you just kind of recap what you were sharing there and share any other thoughts you have on this idea of exploring without self-judgment?
Sure. So in a nutshell, it's the concept that little kids really don't have this big, scary inner critic that we develop as we get older. And so improvisation for children can be a very, very natural activity. For instance, think of 2 and 3-year-olds when music is being played, they automatically start dancing. It's not even a question. They are going to move their bodies. They are going to sing along, watching a little cell phone snippet of my niece, and here she is doing these little dances and singing just the first and last syllable of of the phrases and kind of putting her own spin on it. So that's what it is. It's all about that little kids, they naturally tend towards improvisation without fear.
Awesome. And I think we can all relate to that inner critic. You may not have thought of it by that term before, but we all have that voice in our head who, as soon as we play a wrong note, it's like, oh, I'm such an idiot, or oh, I really should have practiced more. And, particularly, as you say, it's not just in improv, but improv is maybe the purest form where we're really expecting ourselves to create on the spot, and that puts us on the spot to be good. And our inner critic is just waiting for us to do something that is not perfect. So, Sarah, you teach adults and children. What strategies or advice or approaches have you found to help people with this if they're struggling with that inner critic?
Well, you just actually kind of hit on one of the biggest things that I discuss with my students of all ages. It's the concept that if we allow that inner critic to take over, and let's say you definitely, hit a note that kind of sounded like a clunker, or you sang something that didn't sound like you wanted it to. As adults, we are kind of brought out of the moment, and all of a sudden we are more concerned with the fact that, oh my gosh, I just sounded horrible, which in reality, you probably didn't. It just didn't sound the way you wanted it to. So our biggest enemy is actually ourself, because if we allow that inner critic to push us out of the moment, then we are no longer focused on what's going to happen next. And so we have to be really good about releasing that self-judgment and just going, okay, what wasn't what I wanted, keep going. I'm going to find what I want next time.
Nice. I love it. And I was reminded when I started thinking about this topic that actually this came up a little in your interview on the podcast before. I think you were talking about singing specifically when you were younger, and how you'd wait until everyone was out of the house to practice singing. And I think that's like what you were just saying. You need to give yourself an environment, whether it's physically or mentally, where you can really feel like it's okay to make a mistake, and you can stop that instinctive, reactive, oh no, you're terrible voice in your head.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think as musicians, we need to be able to find that safe space to practice, and hopefully, like if you're studying with a teacher, your lesson space should be that safe space. And that's what I tell all of my vocalists and my pianists. We can make as many ugly sounds in this room as we want, and let's explore all of those. And you know what? Eventually, we're going to find some sounds that we really like. So release the self-judgment, leave it at the door, and let's get to work.
So, Adam, how about you? Where has this come up in your musical life?
Oh, I remember. So I do play guitar, but I was always a heavy metal guitar player, just as heavy as I could get. And suddenly I found myself as the frontman and musical leader of a country band. Long story, but it happened, and I'm like, hey,
how has it taken us 2 years to discover this about you? Where are the photos?
Yeah. Oh, I'll find them. Yeah, I got them. Yeah. And so, it's like, hey, you're going to play country now. Were you aware? And so, and I didn't even have any country in my iTunes, didn't have any on none of it. So I quickly downloaded some greatest hits albums and got some guidance on where to start. And I was absolutely terrible. I didn't have the style in my ears. I was trying to learn it and play it, sing it. Because I had to sing too, because that makes it easier, right? And it was just an incredibly difficult learning curve to try to learn this entirely new genre. And by the way, no one else in the band had ever played country either, so I was having to direct them. And I remember just for weeks thinking, this isn't going to work. I'm going to get fired. It's not going to happen. And then I happened to go home. I'd been away from home for a bit, and I got home, and my wife was terribly excited because she's a big country music fan. And it's like, you're finally playing music I like. Here's your guitar, play some. And I was like, okay, you're not going to like it. It sounds terrible. And I started playing, and my kids were really little at the time, and they come out and they just start dancing. And it's like, okay. And my wife, little known to me, was recording me playing. And she's like, that sounded really good. I can't deny it. It sounded terrible. And she played back the recording, and it actually did sound pretty decent. And I did some reflection, and where self-judgment came in for me is I was trying to sound like Garth Brooks. I was trying to sound like Brad Paisley. I can't be Garth Brooks. I'm always going to sound like Adam Liette. So as long as I accept that and say, well, it's always going to have my unique spin on it because that's me coming through my music. And suddenly everything was easier. The performances came easier. The practice came easier. We went from learning very, very early beginner songs to learning some pretty complex songs and playing, 3-hour shows in country, in this new genre that I learned a month ago. But it wasn't until I realized that I can't try to sound like everyone else.
Yeah, super interesting. I love that recording was a factor in that realization for you, because that was definitely something that I had on my mind thinking about this topic. And, Gerald Klickstein talked about that in his contribution for our 100th episode, and it's come up several times on the podcast because, we always recommend at Musically You that can be a great way to become more self-aware, to become more self-accepting, to work on your mistakes, to improve. There's so many ways it helps you to record your practice and listen back. But it can go either way. If you've never heard yourself before, you can come away thinking, oh my gosh, I sounded terrible. And it can exacerbate that problem. And I think there's always that kind of hurdle to get past of being comfortable with how you sound, particularly for singers, but I think in any case. And then you can start to hear it a bit more objectively, and as you experienced, it can be a really fantastic way to step back and be like, oh, okay, if I'm not hearing that inner critic for every single note and being judgmental about every imperfection, actually that sounded pretty good. And I forget who it was I was listening to recently that was talking about how music is fundamentally different from other art forms. It might have been Gerald Klickstein, in fact, because it is temporal. You can't step back and look at your painting, or you can't look at it the way you do with a painting. You can only record yourself and listen back. In the moment, you have no chance of hearing it objectively. And I think that's what makes it so important. And it gives you the ability to separate, I think, the exploration from the self-judgment. So, it doesn't destroy your inner critic, but it lets you at least separate the two so that you're not trying to explore while judging yourself. I think that can be really useful.
But I do often wonder, if I had known she was recording it, would it have been that good? So maybe we should put, maybe there should be a recording tip, have someone record you without you knowing it.
I do that with some of my young kids. If we're performing a duet together, I'll be super sneaky and set up my cell phone on a shelf while they're playing it behind them. So they're not the best shots because it's normally from behind so that they can't see me. But you know what? They always perform better if they don't know they're being recorded.
That's awesome. And I think that's a really great gift to give them, because it does... Yeah, it's beautiful, because they wouldn't have said yes. If you'd asked to record them, they would have said, no, I don't want you to record it. I'm not perfect. And that inner critic would have held them back. But you give them that opportunity, and I think that's really, really neat.
That happened to me in the recording studio once. I couldn't nail this fill, and the engineer's like, just practice it. I won't hit record. And I finally got it. I'm like, okay, let's record it. He's like, I just did. Never mind.
Well, I gotta say, along with Adam, I was through the 80s and 90s, I was a metalhead. Also, and as a metalhead, you do not explore other styles of music. No. That's you will be excommunicated from the metal scene. Okay, maybe it's not that bad, but anyway, at some point, I got into exploring other styles. Because the church we were going to loved to throw in country songs. I think they threw in a disco song at one time, and somehow it became challenges to me. And then they even had a musical. They did 2 years of musicals. One was Footloose, and I immediately signed up for the guitar part. I was like, yeah, let me try that. But it has taken me into areas, so not only country, which the one band I have does country southern rock, but with this tribute artist, it took me into a whole new space, which is when he told me, by the way, we'll be doing disco. We have a disco act and an 80s act, which also, by the way, you have to wear a costume. So to do this, not being judgmental on myself, that became really tough because I don't look like I did when I was in my 20s. I'm 50 now. So, but it's kind of helped me just kind of be open, and I've come to kind of enjoy playing the disco stuff because there's, underneath the disco-ness of it, there's funk and R&B, and for a guitar player, that can be really fun. But you just have to kind of get past, the platform shoes, the leisure suits, and some of the other interesting disco things. But it's kind of cool to do that, especially when you quit judging yourself and going all that. But I find it interesting because I've tried to find other guitar players to do this, and there's a lot of people who won't cut out of like the style they're used to because they're like, I won't do that. And I'm like, well, you could have a really nice gig here if you want to explore this, but they won't do it. They just want to stay in their zone. And I'm like, technically they have the ability to do anything they want, but they won't go out of it. So it's kind of neat to kind of break that wall down so you can kind of explore and enjoy it.
Yeah, for sure. I just finished recording an interview with a guy called Josh Plotner, and one of the big themes was putting your ego aside. Like, he is someone who has constantly put himself into awkward musical situations that he's not quite ready for, and really benefited from it because it kind of forces you to level up. And it's not easy to do. Like, that inner critic is your ego. It's the part of you that says, I don't want to mess up because people will judge me for it. And it's such a powerful thing if you can gradually learn to put that aside. And I love that in your case, it literally involved a costume, because I think, figuratively, that could be a really nice way to do it. If you sit down to practice improvisation, and instead of feeling like I am practicing improvisation, you say, what would this be like if I was just a 5-year-old practicing improvisation, like Sarah was talking about? That mental shift of I'll pretend to be someone who does this can actually be a really nice way to short-circuit that inner critic and separate out the ego and the self-judgment.
Well, it has helped, because if anyone who's known me for a long time knows I'm one of the best beating up of myself people there is. My wife gets on me all the time. She's like, you weren't that bad. And I'm like, no, I've gotten better. But I think I've come to an area, and I think Sarah said something that may have joggled it, is being honest with myself, but not beating myself up. And just finding like an honest area that I can say, okay, this part I did was really good. However, this, I probably need to go over it again and just iron some things out. And that's kind of a nice area to find.
Yeah, and I think that's the big secret that comes up when talking about self-recording, is that if you listen and you try and judge it as a whole, it's really hard not to be really critical. But if you listen and you're like, well, how are my dynamics on that? How was my phrasing? How did I play this bar? Suddenly you realize actually there were a lot of things you were doing right, and it helps you to be objective and to escape from that quagmire of self-judgment. So I think that honesty and objectivity often comes through just being very specific about what you're trying to pay attention to and improve on. Fantastic. Well, I was really keen to look at this one because I think it's something we all continually work on. I am sure you guys would agree this isn't something you master at the age of 12 and never worry about again. In fact, the age of 12 is probably the worst phase for it. But I think we can all do with a reminder that we're all in the same boat. We all have that inner critic, and we're all constantly trying to quiet it down so that we can get on with the business of making music. So thank you, Adam, Sarah, and Stuart, for joining me for this episode. And yeah, stay tuned for the next ones in this series. I believe on the next one we may be talking about the importance of joy and pleasure in your musical journey, which seems like something you shouldn't have to say is important, but I think we'll be digging into why that might be the case. Thank you everyone for listening, and we'll see you on the next one. Hey, in fact, we're not quite done. Anastasia from our team sadly couldn't join us for the group session, but she did want to share something on this topic. So here is Anastasia.
Hi, I'm Anastasia Wojcinskaya. I am the assistant content editor at Musical U, and in my own musical life, I play piano, guitar, bass, synthesizer, and I occasionally sing. I play bass and synth in a band, and I also have a solo electronic project that I'll be working on in the next little while. So, when it comes to exploring without self-judgment, especially as someone who writes original music and then performs it, I'm the kind of person who is quite easily dissatisfied with whatever I'm making. I tend to kind of like romanticize these genius flashes of inspiration, kind of these lightning bolts coming out of the sky and into my brain that help me write amazing music, but obviously that's not always the case. A lot of the time a song evolves out of jamming or improvisation or just kind of casually noodling around on your instrument until you go, oh, hang on, that sounds good. So sometimes I end up making something that to me sounds derivative or boring or whatever. And I've been at it for years. I've been songwriting for probably 5 years now, and I actually get more and more self-critical by the day. So something that's kind of helped me work around that block in my brain, that inner critic, is really to understand that a lot of good music is derivative. As so many podcast guests previously have pointed out, I think most notably Leela Viss, when she talked about the concept of stealing like an artist, nobody starts from a completely blank page when they're writing music, right? So in a way, you should get comfortable with kind of ripping your favorite musicians off, because you do have to start somewhere. And even if you think that you have this flash of inspiration, chances are it's kind of already in your brain. Your subconscious is kind of like feeding you this this idea, right? And it's not necessarily a bad thing if your music sounds like someone else's. You should, in fact, try and take ideas or musical motifs that you like and use them as a starting point for a song. Just remember to kind of like tweak it, make it your own, make it different. And there's a lot of different ways you can do that. You can alter the rhythm, you can alter the phrasing, the articulation, the instrumentation, a lot of different things. So, bottom line, derivative is not necessarily bad. You should take songs that you know and love as a starting point and then explore how to make them your own, how to make them different without that inner voice overpowering you saying, oh, that's too similar, that's not original, you can't pass that off as your own music, because it's just a starting point, right? It's not the final product. Another thing that has really helped me with the idea of exploring without self-judgment is just remembering that the more things that you try out musically, the more your musical information bank increases. You get more ideas to work with. You have more tools in your toolkit. And I find that for every kind of 5 bad ideas that I churn out and I say, okay, I'm probably not going to use this one ever, there's going to be at least one good one that I say, okay, I'll put this, on the back burner or in the back of my brain, maybe for use later. And the great thing about musical exploration, just where, songs can evolve out of jamming or improvisation or that kind of noodling that I mentioned, is exploration can't really be wrong, right? You're just kind of finding different things and seeing what works for you. The worst case scenario, it goes into a direction that you're not too fond of, in which case, fine, scrap it and start over. So exploring without self-judgment is a really, really great way to learn what you like sonically. And this is really valuable, obviously, because it'll make you a better improviser, it'll make you a better songwriter, and it will ultimately make you more satisfied with the music that you do make.
Thank you for listening to the Musicality Podcast. This episode has ended, but your musical journey continues. Head over to musicalitypodcast.com, where you will find the links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as bonus content exclusive for podcast listeners. That's musicalitypodcast.com.